about the network design. And in our previous session, we discussed about the a kind of a life cycle of the network design. So we discussed that it is similar to the software development or software engineering. So similarly, we have uh, life cycle of the network design. So we discussed these things in our last sessions. So this is one example. We discussed the one of the model or methodologies of the network design. Then we came to this about the business goals. So we are designing the network for an organization or for a business. So in that case, we need to have some proper idea about the organization and the business. So we discussed these things last time. So uh, in this case, you have to work very close with the client, and you have to get some information from the client about the organization and what is the plan with the organization. So whether it is going to expand or what are the requirements. So likewise, you have to have some a better idea about the business or the organization when you are designing the network. So we discussed these things last time, and we came to this how to analyze these technical goals. So we start discussing these points. So we start from the scalability, the availability, right? So especially the availability, we discuss about some matrices, right? And the network performance. Then so we discussed the last time, I think we discussed the security, right? So this is the part that we discussed last time. So security is also another very important technical goal of the network. So basically, we have to protect the business data and especially the assets. So when we come to the security, we need to identify these assets. So that is the major part. So it comes under the planning of this security. So you have to identify the network assets that you need to protect. So that is one major thing. So it comes under different categories, like the data that you need to protect, and whatever the components of the network, maybe the different devices that you need to protect. So likewise, you have to think about these different assets. So sometimes it can be different applications or protocols. Likewise, there may be different components that you need to identify. So what are the things that you need to protect? So then you have to develop or you have to design whatever the plan that are going to implement to secure these assets. So that can be different security policies, right? So likewise, you have to define those things, right? And I think I mentioned this last time. So uh, uh, you have to keep this in your mind that whatever the security measures that you are going to implement, so they have to be they should not exceed the cost for the recovery from whatever the security threats or incidents. So that is one important thing that you need to consider when you are implementing the security. So we'll discuss some of the things later as well, because the security, these different policies and all those things might affect the usability of the system as well, right? So if you implement a lot of security measures in the network or in the organization, then that might affect the usability or the user experience of uh, the users. right? So you have to think about these things. So those are the actually those are comes under the trade-offs, right? So anyway, whatever the security measure that you are going to implement, so the cost of that implementation should not exceed the cost to recover from the security incident. So that is one major thing that you have to remember. Let's take a very simple example. Let's say you have uh, let's say you have an access point, right? So you fix that access point, and you have a uh, let's say you have a threat that someone can uh, remove that access point, right? So to protect whatever the access point, you implement some maybe a security measure, or maybe you put it in a cage or you lock it. So you do something like that. So to do that, you invest more than the price of that access point. So that is a very simple example I took. Right. So you should not do such kind of things. So that is what you mean by that, the thing that I mentioned. So whatever the cost for the implementing that security measure should not exceed the cost to recover from that particular incident. So that is one thing you had to remember. So uh, the identification of the network assets. So that is the part. So that is the first step of this security design. So you have to identify the assets that you need to protect, right? Uh, So these assets can be hardware or they can be software. They can be the services or the applications and the data. So uh, the assets have different forms. So you have to identify these different assets and the maybe the intellectual properties, the trade secrets, right? And most importantly, the company's reputation. That is also one asset, one major asset, right? So you have to think about these things. So you have to consider those things as the assets, and based on that, you have to design the security measures that you are going to protect these assets. Uh, So then you can go to the next step, that is analyzing the security risk. So you can consider these different assets, and you have to analyze the potential threats for these assets. So what are the potential threats there to these different assets that you have identified? Then you can think about maybe different attacks from the malicious users, right? So there can be the multiple different type of attacks, maybe like denial of service attacks, man in the middle attacks, right? And people might can use different tools to do some, maybe like port scanners kind of things to check what are the available or open ports in your system. So there can be different tools and different kind of attacks happen to your network, right? So anyhow, in this developing the security requirements, so in there you have to think about, let's say you have identified these assets as data, then you have to think about the confidentiality of data. So how you are going to protect the confidentiality of the data. So which means only the authorized users should be able to access these sensitive information. Then you have to think about the integrity of data. So which means uh, no unauthorized users should not be able to manipulate these data or access these data, right? So integrity. And so likewise, then you have to think about the system availability, the data availability, right? So you have to provide that uninterrupted access to these resources, right? Uh, so likewise, you have to think with different aspects, right? So let's say if you have some remote sites to access, then you can provide these VPN kind of solutions, right? and there can be kind of viruses or malicious softwares. So you can provide some security or some precautions to prevent from these different viruses and malwares. And you can provide some training for the people or the users to avoid these different security problems, because uh, though you have implemented a lot of security measures, algorithms, virus guards, so malware protections, firewalls, everything, but due to some actions by these uh, different users, again there can be some problems in the network, right? So therefore the training that you give for the users is very important, right? So likewise, there are a lot of things that you can think about in this situation, the security, right? So that is one major technical goal in the network design, right? So how to protect the network, right? So yeah, then let's go to the next item of our list, that is the manageability, right? When you come to the manageability of the network, so different clients or different organizations might have different requirements, or they might have different levels of uh, requirements. So let's say some organization may request, uh, let's say they need to monitor, or they need to go uh, uh, into a, let's say, very deep level, and they have to get or they have to manage the router level or switch level, maybe using SNMP kind of protocols, and they have to monitor or the manage the network in a very fine grained level. And uh, there may be some other clients that they don't have that much, I mean, specific goals in the manageability uh, aspect. So there can be, I mentioned you the two ends, right? So there can be clients with these two ends of the manageability, but somehow you have to have some idea about the manageability aspect, right? So again, in this situation also, you have to discuss with the client, and you have to get a proper idea about what the client's requirement is, right? So based on that, basically you have to document their requirement, and on top of that you have to build whatever your design of the network, right? So I have point out some of the uh, yes, that you have to think about thinking consider when considering the manageability of the network. So these 5 points actually are meant by the ISO. So they use the acronym FCAPS, right? FCAPS. So that these are the front letters of these 5 points, FCAPS, FCAPS. So they mention these 5 areas in manageability. So the first part is the fault management. So in this situation, you have to think about how to detect the faults in the network, right? So detecting the faults in the network, and so after you detect that there's some kind of a fault in the network, then you should be able to isolate whatever that fault, right? So uh, that is the next step. So you have to detect whatever the fault in the network, and then you have to isolate it. So detecting and isolating. So, and later on, after you isolate whatever the problem, then you can correct it, right? So that is what comes under the fault management. So once a fault or whatever the problem occurs in the network, then the first thing is you should be able to detect that there's some kind of a fault in the network. Uh, let's say you should be able to see some red flags in the network, right? So that is the detection part. So maybe while you are monitoring the network, you will see some unusual behavior of the network or unusual traffic in the network, something like that, right? So that is the detect detection part. Or maybe you will get some complaints from the users, right? So somehow you have to detect that there's a fault in the network. Then the next part is isolation. So once you have detected, you can maybe you can isolate that section of the network. So which means it will not, whatever the fault or whatever the problem will not affect the rest of the network. Right? So you can isolate it, and then leisurely you can correct the problem. And again, a very important thing is in these kind of situations, so normally the people forget what people forget to do is the reporting part, right? So it is very important to report these things and document these things, right? So normally we don't practice those things. So normally you don't report the things, so you don't document the things. So if this kind of a fault occurs, then you have to report it need to report it for the end users and maybe the top managers, right? So, and the documentation part. So that is again very important because these kind of faults have occurred in these segments of the network, and these are the precautions. So these are the solutions or corrective mechanisms that we have used to solve the problem. And so very important things, because uh, later on some other person or some other technician can refer those things, and they can see that these kind of faults have occurred in the network, and these are the precautions that they have used. And not point, you have to see the trends, right? So because sometimes you can see that there's a trend of having the same fault again and again. So you have to monitor it, right? So you have to track it. So whether there are some related problems occurring in the network, right? So this fault management is very important part of the network manageability, right? So once there's a fault, so first thing you have to, the detection part is there, right? So you have to detect the fault, then you have to isolate it, and you have to correct the problem, then you have to report it and document it, right? So later on you have to track, or you have to keep in that whatever the problem, so whether it is perfectly solved or whether it creates some more issues or more problems to the network, right? So those are very important points in fault management. Okay, so the next part, that is configuration management. So again, it comes under the manageability, because the configuration of the network is a very important thing. So, so once you are get familiar with the configuration things, then actually it will be digested into your system. So you know the commands, and you will do all the configuration parts very quickly, right? And later on, actually, you will not record these things, or if you do some modifications to the configurations, sometimes those things might not be reflected in what sign or diagrams you have. But the problems is later on, once you are doing some troubleshooting, even you can't remember that you have done some configuration modifications to certain devices. So those things might be some ad hoc solutions or ad hoc configurations. So those configurations and these changes, updates or modifications, those things are actually not documented. So that will later on, that will be kind of a problem. So uh, so when it comes to this configuration management, there how these configurations are basically uh, controlled, right? So how these configurations have done, and uh, how these things, how the devices and everything are actually operating, right? And uh, uh, so once working, or once they're operating in the real world, then uh, you have to do some monitoring of the devices, right? So you have to collect some data from these managed devices and check whether these configurations are properly working, whether the network is properly configured. So likewise, the configuration management part is also very important, because if if you need to do some modification to the network, and if you need to do some maintenance, and if you need to do some troubleshooting in the network, these configurations, they are important, right? So if you do not have a proper mechanism to track these things, right? So, or to monitor these things, then again, there will be some issues. So the configuration management part is also a very important thing. The next thing is accounting management. So that is basically you are counting about the network usage, right? So how the network is used. So how the different users use the network, and whether the network, the capacity, the requirement is sufficient. So likewise, it is basically coming under the usage of the network, the accounting management, right? The performance management. So in that case, you are basically analyzing the network traffic, right? And how these applications are working in the network, and whether you can optimize the network. So uh, maybe you can improve the performance by optimizing the network. And again, when you're monitoring the performance and the performance management, basically you can check whether the performance are meeting with the service level agreements. So you know that we discussed that before. So when you are working with the ISPs, then you are having some service level agreements. So these are the conditions of the network that you're requesting, and you are paying for that different conditions, maybe the bandwidth. So likewise, a service level agreement with the ISPs. So when you are doing this uh, traffic analyzing and these things, you can check whether the network meets that service level agreements, and whatever the required uh, conditions of the network is available. So the performance management, and maybe you can think about the expansions as well. So how we are going to improve the network, how we are going to optimize the network. So likewise. And the final part of this FCAPS is the security. So again, you are monitoring the network, and you're testing the security, and you're testing whatever the policies that you are implemented, and you have to think about how to uh, uh, deal with the passwords, right? So maybe password policies, and how we are going to maintain and distribute these passwords, and how we are going to do the authentication, authorization kind of things, and how we are going to manage these encryption keys, right? And auditing, right? So that is again important thing comes under the management, the security management, the auditing of the security policies, right? So there are a lot of things that you need to consider under the security management, right? Monitoring the security policies, testing those things, and think about the passwords, uh, how to authenticate, the authorization, then about the keys, auditing, right? So likewise, there are a lot of things that you need to consider under the security management, right? So this is the manageability of the network. And so once you have implement the network, then you have to think about how we are going to manage those things, right? So you have to think about how we are going to manage the faults, how we are going to manage the configurations, how we are going to count the network, how we are going to manage the performance, security. So these are the 5 points that these caps, right? So you need to think about these things as well when you are designing the network, right? Okay, so these are the rest of the points in the analyzing technical goals or technical goals. So the usability, so that is the easiness of the user, so easy to use of the network, and so that is the usability. Uh, so as I mentioned you before, so when you are implementing some strict security policies, so that will sometimes affect negatively for the usability of the system, right? So you have to balance out that. So sometimes maybe sometimes let's say you have, as an example, let's say you have several locations or several uh, maybe once you are using the network, it will ask for several passwords or authentication steps or something like that, right? So that will not uh, increase the usability, right? Because users will fed up by just typing the password again and again or something like that, right? So you are trying to increase the security, but it will affect the usability, right? So something like that. You have to think about the usability of the network. So that's why it is mentioned under technical goals. The next thing is adaptability. Again, a very important thing, because your network design, your network should be able to adapt new technologies in the future, right? So the protocols might get changed, right? And the devices might get updated, or the softwares or these different services might get updated. So anyhow, your network should be able to adapt to those changes, maybe for at least for several years, right? So that is another important thing that you have to think when designing the network. So how the adaptability of the network, right? So sometimes the get changed, right? So uh, uh, you will introduce some, let's say, new business practices to the organization, or maybe there'll be some new goals added to the organization, right? Or maybe some government policies, right? So government might introduce some new policies, new laws. So in that case, you have to your organization has to adhere to those policies. Then sometimes the network might need to be changed, right? So it should be it should be able to adapt those changes, right? So again, that is a very important thing that you have to think, right? So I know that when we are designing the network or when we are implementing new networks, we are not going to think about these things that much, right? But in theory, right? So these are the things that uh, you have to think, right? So the final point is the affordability, right? So it is very simple. It, whatever the network design, so once you are going to implement it, it has to be cost effective, right? So it has to be affordable. So it doesn't matter that if your organization has a lot of money, then there'll be no problem with that. But most of the time, you have to think about the cost as well, right? So so you have to balance all these things, right? So that's what it comes under this trade-offs. Yeah, I have a slide for that. So once you are making or once you are designing the network, so you have to think about all these things, the points that we have discussed for the last 2 weeks, right? Last two sessions. That is the scalability, the availability, the performance, security, manageability, usability, blah blah blah. So whatever these points, the technical goals that we have discussed. So you have to think about all these things, and you have to discuss with the customers, and you have to come to an agreement that these are the things that we need to focus more, and these are the points that we need to focus less, right? So if you're, let's say, sometimes your organization need the scalability more, right? And sometimes you might not need that 24/7 availability, right? So you have to think about these things, and you have to get a proper idea about these factors when you are going to design the network. So that's why you have to work very closely with your client, and you have to get good idea about these points. So what is the real requirement of the user? So whether, so if this is the, so if you are not going to expand the network, right, then you don't need to think about the scalability, right? And if the organization is not providing services to the outside, and uh, if your organization is running, let's say, from 8 to 5 only, 5 days of the week, and nobody's working overnight, then you don't need to think about that 24/7 availability, right? Because there can have a lot of downtime, right? So if you need to do some maintenance, you can do it after 5 p.m., right? You don't need to think about the maintainability, so the availability, the redundant devices and all the things to provide that 24/7 availability. You don't need to think about that, right? So when it comes to network performance, you can see what are the applications running in the network, right? So based on that, and what are the number of users, and what are the tools or the applications they are going to use. So likewise, if they do not need that higher performance, then you don't need to invest for that, right? So with that, you can get that affordability, right? And again, the security. So if it is a, maybe you are not going to connect to the WAN, if it is just a local area network, then the security measures will be different. And if you are going to connect it to the WAN, then you have to think about the security more. And if you are going to provide some services to the outside, then your system, then you have to protect your whatever the inside things, and you have to think about the services that you're going to give to the outside. So likewise, then the security part become more prominent, right? So likewise, you have to think about these each and every point individually, and you have to think, so these things we don't need that much, but these points we have to consider more. So that is the trade-off part, right? So you have to ask from your customer, so how you are going to spend to these things. So if you want that scalability, then you have to spend this much of money for that. So if you want 24/7 availability, then this is the amount that you have to pay for it, and this is the amount that you have to invest for it. So if you want this much of security, you have to invest this much. So you have to discuss with the client, and you have to educate the client that you have to invest this much of money to get this much of performance, right? Or this much of security. And so that is the thing that you have to do with your customers. And once you come to a balance point, so customer might say that they want this much of performance, this much of security, and they are willing to invest for that level of security and performance, then no problem. You can document it, and you have get the agreement with the customers, and then you can move forward with your designing part, right? So this is the very important point where you discuss with the client, and you have to get the consent of the client or the consent of the customer that these are the levels of this technical goals that they want, right? This is the level of security, this is the level of performance, this is the level of availability, the scalability, right? So you have to get that consent or agreement from the customer, and then you can move into the next phase, right? So is it clear? So I know that this is not like a normal network lecture, and so normally when you imagine about the networking, then it has some practical parts. So this is something like BA, right? Business analytics type of part. So that is basically how the network designing is going on, right? So yeah, it's like the software engineering course. So a lot of theories, right? Okay, anyway, let's move on. Okay, so now works with the client, and you have identified these technical goals, and you have identified the levels of different technical goals that the client have, and you have to document all these things, right? So I'm repeating that again and again. So you have to document it. You have to get the consent or the agreement of the client that this is the level that you are going to provide, right? So later on, you have to measure those. So we'll discuss those things later. You have to measure those performance and all the things later on, and you have to compare it with the design that you have implemented. So anyhow, now you have a proper idea of the goals of the user. So these are the things that they want, right? Right. Okay. So let's move to the next stage. So this is what most of the time you get, right? So most times people are not going to build the network from the scratch, right? So we discussed that before. So most of the time the organizations are starting with a very, let's say, small scale. So in that case, they have a very small network, and once the organization expand, they have to expand the network as well. So that's what normally happens. So which means, as the network designers, you have to deal with an existing network. So it can be a very small local area network, or maybe a uh, uh, network from the kind of ADSL connection from the ISP. So anyhow, there will be an existing network, right? So as the initial part, so after deciding those technical, the next step that you have to do is you have to get a proper understanding of the available network. So that's what we are going to do now. So if you have forgotten, so we are in the top-down network design, not the bottom-up, right? So we are in the top-down network design. So this is what we have to do in the next stage, where you have to get some proper idea or better judgment about the existing network. So without that, you can't implement, or you can't uh, provide that user the client expectation of the network scalability, performance, availability, and blah blah blah, all those things, right? So you have to have a better idea or good idea about the existing network. So uh, so you have to dig deep into the available or the existing network. So which means you have to study about the topology of the network, the physical structure of the network. Then you have to get some idea about how the network is performing and the performance of the network. So whether how it is working, right? So you have to get some idea about these things. Right. So let's discuss these different points. So you have to get some idea about the network infrastructure. So we have different points, right? So we'll discuss one by one later. So first one is you have to get some idea about the network infrastructure, right? So to get uh, so basically, if the current if the previous network administrators, if they have a network map, then this phase will be a little bit easier for you. But with our experience, what we have seen is most of the time you won't have that kind of network maps. So sometimes there may be different maps, but again, it is not easy to understand those things. And when you keep that map in your hand, and when you go around the organization or the buildings, uh, so that is totally different from whatever the map that you have, right? So we have seen those things. So the map is very clear. So it is uh, the map is drawn very perfectly, but when you see in the office environment, you will see some wires here and there, and sometimes you will see some wires coming from upper floor and connected to different switches. So likewise, in the real world, it is kind of a mess, right? So so that's what normally happen in the bottom-up network architectures, because once you need to add new devices to the network administrator might connect a wire to a available switch and plug a new switch to that, and it will the person will give the connection to the new devices. But that is not reflected in uh, the diagrams, and that is not a proper way of doing it. So anyhow, the people get network connectivity, but it is not a proper way of using the network or implementing the network. So anyhow, sometimes you might get some network maps. Sometimes there might be no network maps or the design diagrams. So anyhow, the first thing that you have to do is network maps, or developing the network maps. Uh, so in this case, you can use multiple methods to do it, and different types of tools are also there. So uh, even you can do it with the Visio profession, the professional, the Microsoft version, and there are some the paid tools from IBM and SolarWinds. So they have different number of tools, right? So most of them are paid versions. Uh, so you can use any tool that you like to uh, uh, do the diagramming. But anyhow, you should have some proper diagram. So normally, uh, sometimes I use the packet trace also to do this diagramming, because uh, it is easy and it is familiar for us, and you have all the gadgets and devices in the packet tracer. So sometimes I use the packet tracer to do the diagramming as well, right? So it depends. Anyhow, uh, whatever the familiar tool you can use, and you can uh, draw that network diagram, right? So as I told you, uh, this uh, uh, yes, the tools, right? So the first thing, the network mapping, and when you go to the second point, that is characterizing large internetworks. So when you come to that point, uh, you can use multiple methods for that. So that is uh, either you can start from let's say uh, from the geographic locations, right? So maybe you can start from a country, city. So if you are dealing with a huge network, right? So you can think it from the geographical location, and then you can come to the different sites that you have. The organization might have different sites. Then you can come to that site level. Then you can come to the building level, right? And you can come to the when you come to the building level, then you can come to the different floors of the building. Then you can go to the floor level, and you can go to the room level, so this cubicle level. So likewise, you can start from a big uh, I mean, a wider area like a city. Then you can come to a uh, specific location, up to maybe to the servers, switches, and the location of these devices. So likewise, start it from a bigger landscape, and you can come to a smaller area. So that's one way. And the other method is you can go with the OSI layers, right? So in that case, you can have the diagrams for each and every layers, right? So let's say you can have uh, the diagrams for the application layer. So what are the applications and services running in the network, right? And you can develop a map to show us, maybe let's say the DNSs, DHCP. So likewise, you can draw a map to show the network services. And uh, maybe you can go to the IP level as well, right? So how the internet works, right? So likewise, you can think it from the OSI layer uh, with the this different geographic locations to the devices. So likewise, it depends, right? Uh, Either you can go with the OSI layers or with the geographic location method. So anyhow, you have to uh, characterize this internetwork, right? So how the network is uh, actually implemented, right? So if you can, I mean, it is sometimes you might it is clear for you with the first method, that is you have the buildings, and you mark how these buildings are connected. Then you come to the building, and you make a map of the floors of the building, right? And then you come to the room levels or the cubicle levels. Then you draw the different devices, maybe servers, switches, routers, likewise, and you show the connectivity of these devices. So that will be sometimes clear for you rather than thinking from the OSI level. Uh, so when you go to the OSI level, you are basically drawing the different services and all the things. So that might be confused. So either way, you can go with the familiar method or easy method for you to understand, right? Then we can come to the next point, that is characterizing the logical architecture. So that is, so the previous things will be lot of related to the physical level, right? So this is the logical architecture. So how the topology is built, right? So that is the other thing that you have to think about, right? So while you are thinking about this network infrastructure, you can go one step up, and you can think how these things logically connected, right? So that is the logical topology, like the topologies that we are discussing in the undergraduate level, like the the star topology, ring topology, bus topology. So likewise, so how the network is logically created, right? So the logical architecture of the network. So you have to you can think on that level. Then the next point, that is the characterizing network addressing and naming. So again, so once you build up that logical infrastructure, then you have to think how the addressing part has happened. So uh, how these the networks have addressed different addressing schemes. So you have to document those things, right? Uh, So the next part, that is characterizing wiring and media. So again, another important thing, because how these devices are connected. So how the wiring is going on in the building, and how what are the different types of media which is used to connect to these devices. And I know that most of the time this labeling is not there, right? So that is what we have seen when we go to see the networks, check the networks, and most of the organizations, they don't have this labeling in the net in the cables, right? So that a huge problem in the networks. So there are no labels. So that is another important thing that you have to think about, right? So the uh, this so once you need to scale the network, and scalability, the availability kind of goals, when you are thinking, this cable design is very important. So how the wiring is there, so that part is very important, and that is another thing that people are not going to document, right? So if you have a proper documenting about this existing cabling design, then that will help you to enhance the network, right? And to troubleshoot the network problems, right? So network, this labels, the cables are not labeled. That is a huge problem, right? And again, uh, the distances, right? So that is also very important in this diagrams, because for the cabling, you have to think about the distances. So uh, when you're thinking about the connecting different buildings, then the distance between these buildings also matters. And uh, mm, have uh, so you have to, it is better if you can mark the whatever the wirings wiring in the floors, and that is vertical wirings in the floors, and maybe you might have some horizontal wirings from uh, the cabin the from the cabinets and this closet. So you will have some horizontal wirings. So it is better if you can record these things in the diagrams, right? Because sometimes these distances might affect the performance of the network, right? Because if you are increasing these distances, the cabling distances, then that affect the performance of the network, right? So anyhow, this cabling is very important. The having a proper idea about the cabling is very important in especially the troubleshooting part and the scalability part, right? So try to record those things properly, the wiring, right? And the next point, that is the checking architectural and environmental constraints. Okay, so another important thing, because you need, basically you have in our country we have this power problem and the cooling, right? So those things that we have to think. So especially about the data centers and those kind of things, we have to think about the server racks and all the things. We have to think about the air conditioning. So that is a very important thing that we have to think. And the power. So how we are going to get the power, and what are the backup power sources, right? Because in our country, the power is not there may be some problems with the power, right? So there may be some power outages. So how we are going to provide that, whether you have UPSs, whether you have generators. So you have to think that part, right? And when you come to the architectural things, you have to think about that other natural problems, maybe whether the floods and uh, maybe some other natural disasters, maybe the landslides kind of things, or when you are cabling, especially from building to building cabling, whether uh, whether the cable, maybe roads, right? Because you have to think about these things. So we also have some experience like that. So once the people come and dig, they will dig and break the fiber optic cables. So uh, that part is also important, because if you have recorded those things, if you have the things properly marked in your network map, uh, then it will be easy for you to troubleshoot, right? So the architectural things, you have to think about the architectural things and the environmental concerns. So as I told you, the air conditioning and the power consumption, uh, you have to think in our country, and the physical security of the building. So where you keep your data center, the switch, the router racks and all these things. So whether you have that physical security there, right? And sometimes we have seen some of these things, like uh, actually that is the problem with the air conditioning, right? So sometimes the water get condensed, right? So because of that, sometimes we have seen water inside the data centers, or this uh, server rooms, right? So sometimes you might also see in that. So that is because of the humidity of our country. So we have some problems like that as well. So basically, we don't think about these things, but those are actual problems. So uh, the atmosphere has lot of it is lot of humidity is there. Because of that, the water get condensed, and we have seen some data centers with rain, right? So inside it is raining. So these are actual things that we have to think when designing the network, right? Uh, so and actually, I have seen some of the problems, like the people have put their, I mean, the uh, ins inside the server rooms, right? So they have fixed the racks, but late you can't. I mean, uh, maybe what do you? So sometimes even you can't open the doors properly, right? So even the people don't think about those things actually. So they just come and fix the racks, and so you can't do anything after that. So these things are very crucial things, but we don't think that much, right? So the architectural aspect is very important, right? Okay, so the other thing that is checking a site for a wireless installation. So wireless installation, that is a totally different thing, right? So different area. So how we are going to put these access points, so to cover the entire building. So what are the best places to put all these access points? That is uh, what I have mentioned there. So you have to consider a lot of things like the reflection, absorption, refraction of these RF signals, right? So these radio signals will be reflected, and they might get absorbed, and sometimes because of the concrete, then the signals might not propagate. So because of that, there can be some problems. And normally what we do is uh, with our just the experience, we will put the access point of maybe one or two access points here and there in the building, and we check the signal strength, right? So we can use very maybe you our laptop computers, and we can install a protocol analyzer there, and the protocol analyzer will check the signal strength, and it will do some CRC check and see the errors of the network, and you can map the wireless network strength of the building. So likewise, we can do some uh, measurements and some uh, uh, I mean, some survey, and uh, check the signals, the wireless signals in the building, and we can put the access points in the proper locations, right? So that is the wireless installation. So I have just discussed these things. So I have shared some of my experience. So the summary of this part is the so you have to identify, or you have to understand the existing network. So the first step is to build a proper network map, right? So that is the first thing that you have to do to understand the existing network. So sometimes there may be some existing maps as well, right? So the previous network administrators or designers, they might have create the network maps. So to get a better idea, so you have to, if you have the maps, you have to verify it with the actual network. So if you do not have a map, then you have to create the map, right? So there are different tools that you can use to do it, right? So start. So some are paid. Most of the things are paid tools. So you can use those tools to draw this map. And normally, what we use is what we uh, normally use is the map of the building, and then we mark the devices in that building, in the plan of the building. So that is the normal way. So if normally what we practice, and if not, we can use that OSI level map as well. So normally what we have practice is use the plan of the organization or the plan of the building. So there we simply mark the devices, the location of the devices, right? And with that we can create that internet map. And after that we can go to the logical architecture. So what are the topologies that it has used? And then we can think about the addressing schemes. So how the network addressing has happened, right? And the wiring part, so you have to have a proper idea about the wiring. So where this wiring has gone, so that thing has to be marked in the map. So that is a very important thing. So even the distances. So once, if you have two different buildings or two different sites, so how you have connected those things. So where is that you have the wires. So sometimes most of the time the wires will be underground, right? So you have to record those things in the map, right? Otherwise, it will be difficult for you to troubleshoot if something happens. So if the two building doesn't have the communication, then you should know the exact location of the cable, right? So there's the underground cable is in this location. So you should know that. So otherwise, you can't dig the entire area to uh, get the wire, right? So you can't do it. That is not practical. So you have to know the exact place the wire is, right? So you don't need to worry, because most of the time we have seen that the wires people have put wires like really well, right? So I have seen that. So from one building to the other, it is like a really well, right? So you have Ethernet cables like that. Even I have seen some the network administrator. I don't know who has done that. So you have a bulk of wires, and you take one wire and you use that wire to wrap the other wires, right? So we have seen that kind of network. So that's what normally people do. So don't try to do it. Don't do it, right? So you have to have a proper diagram like that, right? So the other part, the architectural and environmental constraints, very important. So you have to think about this, how how you do the air conditioning, how you do the power, and maybe the ventilation. So heating is yeah, you have to think about the heat as well, right? So air conditioning is enough, right? Then sometimes the electromagnetic interferences, right? So coming from the other, maybe some other devices, right? So where you keep these the racks, right? So yeah, so you have to think about the architectural aspects as well, right? So then the wireless installation, right? Where you are going to put these wireless access points. So as I told you, normally the the designer might uh, put the initial placements with the designer's experience. So normally the designer will think that if you put the access point in these locations, then it will cover the entire building area. But that might not work. Or sometimes it might work. So anyhow, you have to put those initial locations, and then we can do a survey of thing using uh, the laptop that we have, and using a protocol analyzer, we can check the strength of the network, and we can draw again a map of the uh, wireless network, the strength of the wireless network, right? So we can map it and see the locations where we have the network strength, very good network strength, and the low strength. And based on that, we can change the location of the access points to cover the entire area, right? So that is basically network infrastructure. So how you characterize the network infrastructure, right? Okay. Yeah, I have put a link in the LMS about the protocol analyzers, I think. So there are few examples. You can refer them, and if we have some time, we'll do some practicals with the protocol analyzers, right? And there are some arguments that whether the Wireshark is a protocol analyzer or not, right? So Wireshark is just a normally we use it to do the packet sniffing. So whether it is a protocol analyzer or not. So likewise, there are some arguments for the Wireshark as well. So I have put a link in the LMS. So it has some tools. So sometimes you might have used those protocol analyzers. Just go through those things. Just read and get some idea about the protocol analyzer. So what they can do, and what are the techniques that they are using. And I can't remember in the article it has listed note as well, right? So anyhow, so just an example. So just go through that and get some idea about the protocol analyzers, right? Uh, okay. So next point is checking the health of the existing network. So now we have mapped the existing network, right? So we have go through the points, and we have identified the network infrastructure. So now you have a network map in your desk, right? And then you can check the health of the existing network. And so the basically we do this to get an idea about the performance of the existing network. So you are going to study about the performance of the network, so which gives some baseline of the measurement. So which means now you have a plan. So you have discussed with the owners and with the client, and now you have a plan that you have to go to this much of scalability, this much of availability, this much of performance, this much of security in the network. So you have that goal, and before going to that goal, you are going to measure the baseline. So this is the condition, or this is the performance of the existing network. So that's what you are going to check now, right? So developing a baseline network performance. So you are going to check the performance of the network, right? So again, you have to use some tools for this thing, and you can't do it single time. So you have to do it several days, maybe several times. So you have to check the performance of the network by using some tools, right? So you can check, uh, let's say, uh, again, you can use these protocol analyzers to check whether there are errors in the network, whether there are packet losses, the latency of the network, right? And so you can measure those things, and you can have a baseline of the network. So normally it says that it is better if you do it in a normal traffic load. So which means it is not the peak hours, so it is not the idle times. So you can, if you can do it in the normal uh, time, more normal traffic load. So that is better because you can get some average idea about the network. So anyhow, you have to do it for several times and get some average idea about the network performance, right? And the next thing you have to analyze the network availability. So I think we discussed that what do you call that, MTBF and MTTR. I think in one of the previous slides that we have discussed that. So the time between the failures and the time to repair it, right? So that is comes under the availability, right? So you can get some, you have to get some idea about the availability of the network, right? So you can maybe discuss with the customer and get whether they have some idea about this the failure of the networks, right? Or uh, how often the network failures happen and how much time it takes to recover from the problem. So you can get some idea about the network availability, right? So most of the time there will be some records about the network failures. So you can get those things and get some idea about the network availability. And the next thing is analyzing the network utilization. So in here, basically, utilization means the bandwidth of the network. So again, you have to get some average value. So you have to do it, you have to check it for several times, right? And you have to get some idea about the bandwidth utilization of the network, right? So as I have mentioned, so again, you can use some protocol analysis to do that. So measure in the bandwidth utilization by protocol, right? So you can use the protocol analyzers and you can see, you can check. So what are the protocols which are using the bandwidth, right? So for which level or which percentage these protocols are using the bandwidth. So likewise with that, you can get some idea about the applications and the protocols which are using in the network, right? So for all these things, you have to use some tools like whatever the protocol analyzers, right? Then the network accuracy. So basically, it is the error rate. So it is the bit error rate or frame error rate or something like that. So have to check the error rate of the network, right? And the analyzing errors on the switched and Ethernet networks, right? So how much of collisions are there, right? Then retransmissions. So likewise, you have to think about these things. So normally nowadays we have switched MACD, right? So mm, so you have to check those things. So if you have a lot of collisions and maybe retransmissions, then it might have some problems with the switches, the NICs, right? So there may be some issues like that. And then the network efficiency, right? So uh, uh, yeah, when you come to the network efficiency, uh, there actually, I think we discussed that one before this one, the the frame. So we discussed about the frame size. So once the frame size increases, uh, you know that the control signal or these frame headers, the number of frame headers get decreases. So which means you are sending a huge amount of data in a single frame compared to the other small frames. So because efficiency increases, and even in the Ethernet, I think I mentioned that one when we discussed this point, where once there's a minimum uh, uh, size in the Ethernet frame. So if you are sending messages less than that minimum size, then there can have some collisions. Right? So we call that late collisions. And so there can be collisions. So uh, we can check the efficiency of the network just by using some tools, right? And the delay, the response time. So we have to measure these things, and we have to get some idea or the idea about the network or the health of the network, right? So uh, we have created a map of the network, and we get some idea about the infrastructure, and after that we had to check the current performance of the network. So we had to uh, do different checks by using a number of tools, and get some idea about the health of the network. Right. So so we have discussed a lot of things. Actually, I have just talked for 1.5 hours now. So let's do a small activity, right? So I will on a small activity in the LMS. So you can do it with your friends, right? So otherwise it will be uh, uh, I'm just talking. So therefore, let's do a small activity. Uh, right. So I have activated one activity. So it is again a case study. So I will put you just read the activity, and I have asked one question that is about the security of the network. So I will put you into some breakout rooms, and just discuss with your friends about this case study, right? Uh, okay, so let me put you into some breakout rooms, and yeah, I will put you into 4 breakout rooms. So just discuss it with your friends. This is not an assignment. Uh, just do it as a fun activity, because most of the questions will be similar to like this, because this is not that much of a technical course. So there are some technical aspects, so we'll discuss them later. But most of the time it will be just like the stories, right? So you have to do some analytical things. You have to discuss with the people, and you have to analyze these things. So therefore, most of the time the activities and the questions are with the case studies, right? So I have activated that activity, and I'll create some breakout rooms. So please discuss the things with your friends, and do some brainstorming and try to find the answers, right? Yes, I have put a forum in the LMS. So you can share your answers in the forum post, so the others can actually leave your answers. And so please share your thoughts in the forum, and you can have a discussion there as well. And so let's end the today's session here, and we'll meet on the next day. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.